The room smelled like recycled air and old politics. 17 species sat around the Galactic conclave table, and every single one of them had been doing this long enough to be bored by it. The Keth delegation clicked their secondary jaws in a rhythm that meant impatience. The Veth hovered near the ceiling, translucent and vaguely irritated, their form shifting the way smoke shifts when someone opens a window. The Rael sat perfectly still, the way predators sit still, not relaxed, never relaxed, just waiting. Ambassador Yara Ose walked in 7 minutes late. She was carrying a data pad and a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and she sat down without apologizing, because she never apologized for being late, because she was always late, and in 11 years of diplomatic service, nobody had found a way to make her stop. She set the coffee down. She looked at the data pad. She looked up. "Right," she said. "Let's get through the trade stuff first." They got through the trade stuff. It took 2 hours. The Mu'in Iraq disputed a tariff on biological compounds. The Rael wanted a border clarification in the 7th Arm. Yara handled all of it the way she handled everything, with the particular calm of someone who had stopped being impressed a long time ago. The other delegates watched her the way they always watched humans, with a kind of patient, careful attention that looked like respect, and was actually something else. 300 years of careful work. That was what the attention was. 300 years of trade agreements and cultural exchanges, and soft, gentle, patient management, the kind that doesn't look like management at all. Humanity had come into the galactic community loud and messy, and dangerously curious. And the older species had done what older species do with younger ones that showed too much potential. They had given them things to care about, treaties, alliances, a seat at the table. Enough comfort to slow the hunger down. It had been working. Then Yara reached the last item on her data pad. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't stand up. She just read it the way she'd read the tariff dispute and the border clarification and the 3 procedural motions before it. The Human Continuity Project completed its 3rd and final verification trial 6 weeks ago, she said. Stable voluntary post-biological transition has been achieved. The transition is fully reversible, non-contagious, and entirely optional. We're notifying the conclave as a courtesy, as per Article 9 of the Galactic Transparency Accord. Silence. Not the polite silence of a room waiting for someone to finish. The other kind. The kind that has weight. Leth Coordinator, Seer of the 7th Hatching, the Keth delegate, was the first to find her voice. Post-biological transition, she repeated slowly. You mean consciousness upload? Digital transference? Yara shook her head. No. Then what? Something else. The Veth began to vibrate. It started low, below the range of most species hearing, but the room's environmental systems picked it up and flagged it. And 3 separate translation algorithms tried to render it, and all 3 failed and returned the same error. No equivalent concept in any registered language. Delegate Prime of the Rail, a being called Dreha, who had personally overseen 14 military campaigns, leaned forward. His voice was very controlled. What does it look like? Yara looked at him. For just a moment, one beat, one single breath, something moved behind her eyes. Not pride, not triumph, something quieter than both. We haven't fully decided, she said. The room erupted. The Keth delegates were on their feet. The Mu'in Iraq's probability form contracted sharply, which, for their species, was the equivalent of a shout. 2 of the smaller delegations began transmitting emergency signals to their home systems. Dreha sat perfectly still, which was worse than if he had moved, because Dreha perfectly still meant Dreha calculating. Yara let it go for 30 seconds. Then she stood up, collected her cold coffee and her data pad, and walked to the door. The full technical report will be filed with the Conclave archive by end of week, she said. If you have questions, my office is open. Ambassador, Dreha's voice cut through the noise, clean and hard. What do humans intend to do with this capability? She stopped at the door. She thought about it genuinely, visibly thought about it. The way people think when they're not performing thinking, but actually doing it. Live, she said. Same as always. just with fewer restrictions on what that means. She left. The door closed. The Veth's vibration changed frequency. Every delegate in the room felt it in their teeth, in their bones, in whatever they had instead of bones. The translation systems tried again. This time they returned one word: recognition. Nobody asked what that meant. Nobody wanted to know yet. In the corridor outside, 12 humans were waiting. They looked normal. Every single one of them, 2 women talking quietly, a man reading something on a small screen, a teenager who appeared to be eating a sandwich. Baseline, unremarkable. The kind of people you'd walk past 100 times and never look twice at. Yara nodded once. They looked up. They smiled. The kind of smile that isn't about happiness, exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down now. Then they stopped looking like anything at all. Not violently. Not with light or sound, or any of the dramatic signals that the galaxy's species had come to associate with transcendence. There was no flash. No disappearance. It was slower than that, and stranger than that. Like watching a word you've read 1,000 times suddenly stop looking like a word. Like the moment a shape stops being a shape and becomes the space around it instead. The corridor was empty. It was also, in some way, that none of the surveillance systems could quantify, and none of the diplomatic security staff could explain in their reports. Not empty at all. Inside the conclave chamber, the argument was still going. Voices overlapping. Data being pulled. Emergency protocols being cited. 300 years of careful, patient, deliberate work coming apart at every seam at once. The coffee on the table had gone completely cold. Nobody touched it. In the corner of the room, the Veth drifted lower than they had drifted in 11,000 years, and the sound they made was below hearing, and the translation system rendered it, finally, not as a word or a phrase, but as a question mark. Just that. A question mark. Sitting in the log file of a diplomatic chamber where everything had just changed, surrounded by 17 species, who were only now beginning to understand that they had been watching a door this whole time, without ever once asking where it led. Seer of the 7th hatching had 17 forms open on her console, and none of them were cooperating. She was a xenobiologist by training, a diplomat by accident, and a bureaucrat by the kind of slow, creeping fate that happens to people who are too good at filing things correctly. She had spent 22 years cataloging the known species of the Galactic Conclave, their biology, their social structures, their threat potential, their resource dependency. She was very good at it. Organized. Precise. The Keth Science Directorate had given her 4 commendations and a bigger office. She was staring at a blank field on Form 7G, which asked for Time's primary biological substrate times, and had, in 22 years of her using it, never once been left empty. She typed, "Unknown." The system flagged it. "Unknown is not a valid entry. Please select from the following 847 substrate categories." She stared at the screen. She typed, "Variable. Variable is not a valid entry." She typed, "Refuses to hold still." The system crashed. Seer leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She had been 7 years old when humans first made contact with the Keth. She remembered her mother explaining it to her, a young species, her mother had said, from a small yellow star system. Bilateral symmetry. Calcium skeletons. Serotonin dependencies. Prone to emotional decision-making. Fascinating, her mother had said, in the tone that Keth scientists used for things that are fascinating. The way a malfunctioning piece of equipment is fascinating. Something to study, to understand, to carefully account for. Manageable was the word her mother had actually used. Seer had grown up and become a scientist and had, in her professional opinion, agreed. Humans were extraordinary in many ways and dangerous in a few, but they were times legible. You could read them. You could build a model of them. You could predict them within acceptable margins. The Keth had built an entire diplomatic strategy on this, and it had worked beautifully for 3 centuries. And now she was sitting in front of a crashed filing system at 3 in the morning trying to describe something that had apparently stopped being describable. The human's name was Dae-ho. He'd come in that morning as a voluntary research participant. He'd been early. He'd brought her a coffee that was, annoyingly, exactly the right temperature. He sat across from her now in the small interview room, 24 years old by human reckoning, unremarkable in every visible way, wearing a green jacket that had too many pockets. He looked like someone you'd pass in a hallway and immediately forget. "So," Seer said, "tell me what you are. In your own words." Dae-ho thought about it. He was one of those people who actually thought before speaking, which Seer found either admirable or suspicious depending on her mood. Today, it was suspicious. "You know that feeling?" he said slowly. "Right before you remember a word you forgot? Like it's right there, and you know what it means, and you know what it feels like, but the shape of it hasn't arrived yet?" Seer wrote this down. "Yes. It's a bit like being that. Permanently." She put her pen down. She picked it up again. She wrote, "Subject describes state as pre-resolution, consistent, present, formless in the specific way of something about to have form." Then she looked at what she'd written and wasn't sure if it was science or poetry and wasn't sure that was a distinction that applied anymore. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "No." He seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "It's actually very comfortable. Like when you've been tense for a long time and then you're not. And you still experience yourself as yourself? As Dae-ho?" He smiled. "More than I ever did before, honestly." Seer thought about this. She thought about the 17 forms on her console. She thought about the field that asked for times, primary biological substrate times, and the 847 categories that didn't include whatever this was. She pulled out a new form. "I'm going to ask you some standard questions. For the record." "Sure." "Height?" "About 180. "Currently?" He paused, tilted his head. "Yes?" "I think yes. I'm not paying attention to it the way I used to, but yes, 180. She wrote it down. She did not write the pause. Later she would think about why she didn't write the pause and not have a good answer. They went on like that for an hour. Normal questions, mostly normal answers, the session creating the comfortable illusion of normalcy, the way a rug creates the comfortable illusion of there being no floor beneath it. Seer asked about nutrition, and Dae-ho pulled a protein bar from one of his jacket's many pockets and offered it to her with the easy generosity of someone who doesn't think twice about sharing things. She took it. She didn't know why. She wasn't hungry. She ate it anyway. It was a completely normal protein bar. She would later spend 6 pages of her official report on its molecular composition. At the 47-minute mark, while Dae-ho was describing the transition process in terms that kept sliding away from her understanding like water off glass, Seer's eyes dropped just briefly, the automatic flicker of attention that happens when something moves at the edge of vision. His shadow moved. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who wasn't a xenobiologist trained to notice biological anomalies. It just adjusted. The way a person shifts their weight. The way you lean slightly when you're listening. Dae-ho was perfectly still, his hands flat on the table, and his shadow settled into a new position like it had gotten more comfortable. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. She looked back up at his face. He was still talking. She was still taking notes. The interview continued for another 16 minutes, and she kept her pen moving, and her expression neutral, and when it was over, she thanked him, and he left, and she sat for a long time in the empty interview room. She did not put the shadow in the report. She wasn't sure it would fit in any of the fields. She wasn't sure there was a word for what it meant. She was very sure in the specific, cold way that certainty comes when you don't want it that the shadow had not moved randomly. It had moved with intention. Not the intention of a malfunction. Not the intention of something going wrong. The intention of something that had gotten large enough to need a little more space than the body beside it, and had simply, quietly, without drama or announcement, taken it. She went back to her office. She opened Form 7G. She stared at the field for time's primary biological substrate. She typed, "See attached notes." The system accepted it. She had 41 attached pages, and none of them answered the question. And she was beginning to think that was because the question itself was the wrong shape, that she was trying to put a measurement around something that had stopped agreeing to be measured. The way the horizon stops being a destination when you actually walk toward it. She went home. She did not sleep. In the morning, Her daughter asked her what she was thinking about over breakfast, and Seer looked at her, 7 years old, curious, already asking questions that were too big for her age, and said, "Work." Her daughter nodded. She had her mother's eyes, the kind that notice things. "Is it interesting?" she asked. Seer thought about the shadow, the protein bar, the pre-resolution feeling, the 17 forms, the word times, manageable times in her mother's voice, 22 years ago, slow and certain and wrong. "Very," she said. Fleet Sovereign Dreha had never lost a war. This was not luck. Luck was for species that hadn't done the work. Dreha had won 14 campaigns across 31 years of active command because he understood one thing better than any other commander in the Rail Dominion, better than any commander in the galaxy. If you asked him, and people did ask him, because he had won 14 campaigns, you win by knowing what the enemy loves. Not what they fight with, not what they fight for, in the abstract, noble, speech-giving sense. What they actually, physically, personally, love. What they will bend for, what they will break for, what they wake up afraid of losing. Find that thing, the city, the family, the home system, the idea of themselves, and you hold it, and the war is already over. The fighting is just paperwork. He had applied this to every species he had ever faced. The Mu'an Arak feared dissolution, threatened their probability coherence, and they negotiated within 48 hours. The Keth feared irrelevance, questioned their scientific authority, and they became manageable. Even the ancient ones had their pressures, their sensitivities, their edges that you could lean on carefully. He had spent 3 months studying humans before ordering the fleet to move. Humans feared loss. Specifically, they feared losing the people they were attached to. They were extraordinarily, almost embarrassingly, vulnerable to this. They made decisions that contradicted their own survival instincts in order to protect the people they loved. Dreha had seen the data, had read the historical files, the wars, the sacrifices, the extraordinary things humans did for the specific, irreplaceable faces of the people they chose. It was their greatest weakness, and also, in some dim way he didn't fully examine, the thing about them he found hardest to dismiss. Bodies, people, faces. That was the leverage. He moved 42 warships into the Terran exclusion zone on a Thursday. Earth was blue and white from orbit. It always was in the images. He had looked at those images many times, and they had always struck him as almost aggressively beautiful. The kind of planet that made you understand why a species would fight hard for it, which was useful information. The kind of planet that made you understand why a species would make terrible decisions to keep it safe, which was more useful still. The hail went out. Standard intimidation protocol. Response expected within 4 minutes. They responded in 11 seconds. A woman's face on the screen. She appeared to be sitting somewhere comfortable, not a command center, not a diplomatic chamber. A room with plants in it. Natural light. She looked up from something she'd been reading and smiled in the specific way of someone who is genuinely pleased to see you, which was immediately and profoundly disorienting. "Hello," she said. "I'm Constance. You're early. We weren't expecting the rail for another week, based on the fleet movements. Can I get someone on the technical side for you, or—" "I am Fleet Sovereign Dreha, of the Rail Dominion," Dreha said. "I am speaking under authority of the Galactic Security Compact, Article 14 Clause." "Right, the Containment Clause." She wrote something down, actual pen and paper which he found bizarre. "Got it. Go ahead." He delivered the ultimatum. He was good at ultimatums, the pacing, the weight, the precise calibration of threat to make it feel inevitable rather than aggressive. Return to biological baseline. Submit to Galactic Oversight Protocol 7. Allow rail inspection teams full surface access within 72 hours. Failure to comply would result in targeted infrastructure removal, followed by escalating action. Constance listened. She wrote things down. She nodded occasionally, not in agreement in the way of someone taking notes. When he finished, she looked up. "Can I ask a quick question?" He granted it, because denying it would look like fear. "What exactly?" she said, with genuine curiosity, not challenge, not amusement, genuine wanting to understand curiosity. "Are you planning to destroy?" Dreha opened his mouth, Closed it. Your infrastructure, your communications, if necessary, your... Right, but specifically. She tilted her head. I'm asking practically. When you say targeted infrastructure removal, what are your targeting systems finding down here? Because I want to make sure we're looking at the same picture. The officer at the targeting console had gone very still. Dreha didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Constance's face. Run the targeting sweep again, he said quietly. The officer ran it again. The results were the same as the first sweep, and the second, and the 7 sweeps before the call had connected, that he hadn't mentioned because they hadn't made sense, and he had assumed they would resolve. The planet was there. His instruments confirmed it completely. Mass, gravity, atmospheric composition, orbital data, all present, all consistent, all exactly as the record showed. There were no valid targets. Not damaged, not shielded in any way. The system recognized as a shield, simply not present as targets. The targeting system was working perfectly. It was looking at a planet full of whatever humans were now, and returning the same result you'd get if you pointed your weapons at open water and asked them to find something to hit. The system wasn't confused. It was accurate. There was just nothing down there that could be destroyed, in any way the system had a category for. Dreha sat with this information for 4 seconds, which was the longest 4 seconds of his professional life. Constance, he said. Yes? Where are the humans? It wasn't quite a question. She seemed to understand this. Here, she said simply. Same as always. We just stopped being where you were looking. The bridge was very quiet. 42 warships, 31 years of campaigns, 14 wars, won by finding what the enemy loved and pressing on it until they bent. He had no place to press. There were people on Earth. He did not doubt this. But they were not where his instruments looked for people. They were not in the shape that his weapons were built to find. 300 years of leverage bodies and cities and faces, and the specific human terror of losing the people they loved, and all of it depended, he saw now, on humans continuing to be the kind of thing that could be threatened. They had stopped. Not out of bravado, not as a tactical maneuver. They had simply let go of the thing he'd planned to hold. The way you let go of a key when you no longer need to lock anything. Safe travels, Constance said. She was already looking back at whatever she'd been reading. We'll be in touch. The screen went dark. Dreha ordered the withdrawal at a normal pace, not a fast one, because fast would look like running, and he was a fleet sovereign, and fleet sovereigns do not run. They left at a normal pace. In the silence after the order, someone on the bridge asked what she had meant by times we'll be in touch. Dreha didn't answer. He sat in his command chair for the 3 days of travel back to Rael space, and he wrote and deleted his report 11 times, because every version of the truth sounded like an excuse. And he was not a man who made excuses. And he had also spent 3 months finding humanity's leverage, and had come back with nothing. And the 2 most important things he had ever believed about winning, that everything can be threatened, and everyone has something to lose, had just been taken apart, quietly by a woman in a room with plants in it who had seemed, the entire time, genuinely happy to see him. He filed the report on the 3rd day. It said, "Tactical engagement not recommended at this time." It did not say why. Nobody who had been on that bridge said why. Some questions you don't put in writing, not because you're hiding something, because some things, once you write them down, become real, in a way you aren't ready for yet. The meeting had not happened in 11,000 years. There was no formal invitation, no scheduled time, no chamber prepared or agenda distributed. It happened the way the most important things between the oldest beings in the galaxy happen, through a shift in awareness. The way you know someone has entered a room before you hear them, before you see them, before any instrument of any kind confirms it. You simply know. The Veth knew first. They were always first. Being made of resonance and memory, the way other things are made of carbon and want. They gathered themselves into a shape that meant time's attention, which for the Veth was very different from a body, but served a similar purpose, and they moved to the place where meetings happened for beings who had stopped needing physical locations for things. The Mu and Iraq were next. They existed as distributed probability fields, not here or there, but times, likely here, Not this or that, but times. Probably this times. And they contracted, pulling their spread-out sense of self into something denser and more present. The last time they had done this was during a crisis that the younger civilizations had no records of. The Mu'anak had hoped never to do it again. The compression was not painful, but it was uncomfortable in the way that certainty is uncomfortable for a species that lives in likelihood. The silence that speaks arrived without arriving, because they had never left, because they were the kind of ancient that does not travel but simply times, is times in more places than most things can be at once. 3 species, the oldest things in the galaxy that still held opinions. The Veth spoke first. Their communication was not language in any standard sense. It was closer to weather, to the feeling of a season changing, to the specific pressure in the air before something breaks. The translation, rendered afterward by systems that did their best and admitted it wasn't enough, took 3 pages and came down to this. We knew this day would come. We have been waiting for it since before your youngest civilizations learned to count. The Mu'anak responded. Their contraction tightened. For a species that expressed itself through probability, this was as close as they came to a flinch. What they said translated roughly as, knowing does not make it easier. The silence that speaks said nothing. This was normal. The silence that speaks never initiated communication. In 11,000 years of recorded interaction, they had only ever responded. They were the oldest and the most careful, and they had learned, in ways that left marks, that speaking first changed things in directions that couldn't be undone. The Veth produced a record. It was old. Not old in the way that documents or files are old. Old in the way that stone is old. The way the light from a dead star is old. Carrying information across a distance so large that the source no longer exists by the time it arrives. It was a record from before the conclave. Before most of the species that now considered themselves ancient had their first fire, their first city, their first understanding that they were not alone. A record of another species. The Mu'anak expanded slightly involuntarily, the way something expands when it touches heat. They had seen this record before. Long ago. In a context they had spent 11,000 years trying not to think about. The record showed a species. Biological. Curious. Dangerously so. In the early stages, the kind of dangerous that comes from wanting to understand everything, before you have the wisdom to use understanding carefully. They had spread across their local systems quickly, had asked questions that older civilizations found uncomfortable, had reached toward the edges of what was known with the particular hungry eagerness of something that has not yet learned that edges exist for reasons. And then, they had changed. Not violently. Not dramatically. It had taken 3 generations. The record showed. The first generation of the transition had still looked mostly like themselves, the way Deho looked mostly like himself. The second generation had been harder to find. The third, the record's data ended there. Not because the species had been destroyed, because the instruments that made the record had simply stopped being able to see them. Not interference. The Veth's resonance confirmed it. Pure inability. The same inability that Dreha's targeting systems had returned from Earth orbit. They outgrew the light we used to look for them, the Veth said. The Mu'anak asked the question that had been sitting in the meeting since it began, the one all 3 of them had been circling. What happened after? A long pause. In beings this old, a pause is not hesitation, it is consideration. The kind that takes into account things that shorter-lived minds can't hold all at once. The Veth said, the galaxy changed, slowly. The way a room changes after someone leaves it. Things that had been difficult became easier. Conflicts that had seemed permanent simply resolved, the way weather resolves. Problems that had been growing for 10,000 years stopped growing. Another pause. We did not understand why. For a long time we attributed it to chance, to the natural movement of civilizations. The Mu'anak contracted again. But it wasn't chance. No, the Veth agreed. It was them, from wherever they had gone. In ways we could not see or measure, working on the things that mattered in the ways that only something without a fixed form can work on things. The silence that speaks Initiated communication. Every recording system, in every location where this meeting was somehow taking place, flagged this simultaneously. In 11,000 years, across every crisis and conflict and moment of galactic consequence, the silence that speaks had never spoken first. The Veth contracted slightly, the equivalent for a being of resonance, of holding your breath. What the silence said did not translate cleanly into any language. What the translation systems produced, after running it through every framework they had, was this: they are not becoming what we became. We walked away from form because we were tired. They are walking away because they are ready. These are not the same journey. Do not make the mistake of thinking you understand the destination because you recognize the first step. The meeting held this for a long time. The Veth's recognition signal from the conclave chamber, the one that the younger species had heard without understanding, had not been distress. The Veth had been at the conclave when the old species had begun their transition, 11,000 years ago. They had heard the frequency then. They had recognized it when it came from Yara Ose's announcement. Not the sound of something ending. The sound of something that had been waiting a very long time to begin. What do we tell the younger civilizations? The Mu'anarak asked. The answer came from all three of them, not quite simultaneously, a rare alignment that meant it was true in the deepest way any of them could verify. Nothing. Not cruelty, not arrogance. The Keth and the Rael and the 100 other species in the Galactic Conclave would ask why the eldest ones had gone quiet, and they would assume it was indifference, or condescension, or some complex political calculation. They would argue about it in their universities and war rooms for centuries. They would be wrong. The truth was simpler and harder than any of those things. The truth was that you cannot explain a door to someone who doesn't yet believe in walls. You cannot describe a horizon to someone still staring at the ground. You cannot tell a species that every limit they have accepted about what they are allowed to become is not a law, but a choice. Not until they are ready to hear it. And readiness is the one thing that cannot be given, only arrived at. The Veth drifted. The Mu'anarak expanded back to their natural distribution. The silence that speaks returned to being present everywhere and visible nowhere. The meeting ended without ending, the way very old things end, not with a conclusion, but with a kind of settling, like sediment finding the bottom of still water. Somewhere in a corridor outside a diplomatic chamber, 12 humans had stopped looking like anything at all. Somewhere in Rael space, a fleet sovereign sat with an unfinished report. Somewhere in a Keth research facility, a xenobiologist was writing 6 pages about a protein bar. The galaxy turned. The stars did what stars do. And in the deep places where the oldest things lived, in the resonance and the probability and the silence, something that felt like relief moved slowly through everything. The way warmth moves through a room when a window that has been closed a very long time is finally, carefully, opened. The hill smelled like grass after rain. Rael 7 was a colony world, one of the newer ones, settled 3 generations back, still in that stage where the buildings were slightly too neat and the trees were slightly too evenly spaced. Everything arranged by people who were building a place to live, rather than people who had always lived there. But the grass was real. The rain had been real. And the hill that Sear's daughter climbed every afternoon after school was real in all the ways that mattered to a 7-year-old. Which is to say, it was high enough to feel like an achievement, and soft enough not to hurt when she rolled down it. Her name was Tay. She had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard. And she was thinking hard now, sitting at the top of the hill with her knees pulled up, watching the woman who had been there when she arrived. The woman had been sitting in the grass, facing away, watching the horizon. She looked completely normal. A human woman, brown skin, natural hair, wearing the kind of plain clothes that suggested she had stopped paying attention to what she wore a long time ago. Not out of neglect, but out of having more interesting things to pay attention to. She looked about 40, maybe younger. It was hard to tell with some people. She had turned when Tay reached the top of the hill, and smiled, and said her name was Yara, and asked if Tay minded sharing the hill. Tay had said she didn't mind. She had sat down a few feet away. The light was long and golden in the late afternoon way that made even ordinary places look like something worth remembering. My mom talks about humans sometimes, Tay said, because she was 7 and had not yet learned the social art of building up to things. Does she? Yara said. She's a scientist. She studies you. Tay paused. She doesn't sleep very well anymore. Yara looked at her. Something in her expression shifted, not pity, nothing that soft or simple. More like recognition. The way you look at a sentence in a book that is about something you know. She's trying to understand us, Yara said. Are you hard to understand? Yara seemed to genuinely consider this. We're probably easier to understand than we used to be, she said. The hard part for most species isn't understanding what we are now. It's accepting that what we are now is what we always could have been. That's the part that's uncomfortable. Tay thought about this with the focused seriousness that children apply to things that feel important. What does it feel like? She asked. Being what you are now. The light moved through the grass. Somewhere far below the hill, something that might have been wind moved through the colony's arranged trees and made a sound like breathing. Yara was quiet for long enough that Tay thought she might not answer. Then she said, You know how sometimes you've been carrying something for a long time? Something heavy. And you've been carrying it so long that you forgot it was heavy? It just felt like normal. Like that was just what your arms felt like. Tay nodded. She knew this feeling, actually. She'd carried her school bag wrong for a year before her mother fixed the straps. And then someone adjusts it, Yara said. Or you put it down for a second, and your whole body realizes at once that it was heavy. And that first moment of not carrying it, that's the feeling. Except it doesn't go away. Tay looked at her hands. Were you scared? A little. Yara said it simply, without making it brave or small, just as a fact. Change is always a little scary. But being scared of the right things is different from being scared of the wrong ones. For a long time, humans were scared of the wrong things. Like what? Like not being enough. Like being too much. Like what other people would think of what we were becoming. A pause. Those fears have a weight too, and they're so easy to pick up again that you have to choose, every time, to put them down. Tay looked at Yara carefully, the way her mother looked at things she was trying to understand. Do you still look like you? She asked. Yara looked back at her. More than I ever have. But you don't look like... Tay stopped. She wasn't quite sure how to finish the sentence without being rude. Like I used to? Yara helped. Tay nodded. The way you look, Yara said carefully, isn't the same as who you are. For a very long time, humans knew this. Knew it like you know something you've been told 100 times. Up here. She touched her head. But it's different to know it up here and to actually live it. To stop letting the shape tell you what you're allowed to be. My teacher says humans used to be afraid of dying, Tay said. We were. Are you still? Yara thought about this for long enough that Tay got the sense it was a real question. One that deserved actual thought and not a comfortable answer. We're still careful, Yara said finally. Being careful about existence isn't the same as being afraid of losing it. We still value what we have, what we are, the people we love. We just don't let the fear of it ending make us smaller than we're supposed to be. Tay wrote this down in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. Her mother had given her the notebook and told her to write down things she wanted to think about later. She was good at filling it. She wrote, Shape is not who you are. Fear of ending makes you smaller. Be careful, not afraid. She looked at what she'd written. It didn't look like much. She had a feeling it was going to mean more in a few years. Yara stood. She was taller standing than she looked sitting. She brushed the grass from her clothes and looked out at the horizon for a moment, the way people look at something they're saying goodbye to, except her expression wasn't sad. It was the expression of someone who has seen a lot of horizons and finds each one genuinely interesting. It was nice to meet you, Tay, she said. You too, Tay said. Then, will you come back? Yara smiled. We're always around. You just have to know how to look. She walked down the hill. Tay watched her go. She watched the way a 7-year-old watches things, without filtering it through what she was supposed to notice, just taking in all of it. The way Yara moved. The long light. The grass bending in whatever was moving through it. Her eyes dropped to the ground. The footprints in the soft earth from Yara's walk down the hill were different. Each one a slightly different shape, not randomly, not messily. The way handwriting changes slightly with each letter, even though you're still making the same letter. The way a signature is always itself, and always slightly different, and is both of those things at the same time. Like something that had decided it could choose what it left behind, and was still deciding, freely, with interest, as it went. Tay didn't go home right away. She sat at the top of the hill until the light went from gold to purple, writing in her notebook and thinking about shapes and weights, and the difference between knowing something in your head and living it, and the distance between the two, which is the distance everyone has to cross eventually, alone, on their own time, when they are finally ready. The galaxy did not end. No trumpet. No transformation visible from space. The stars kept burning with the same total indifference to the concerns of the small, warm things orbiting them that stars had always maintained. The Keth kept filing forms. The Rael kept their fleets moving. The Muan Arak kept existing in their distributed, probabilistic way that had always been slightly unsettling to look at directly. But something had shifted, slightly. The way a room is different after someone extraordinary has been in it. You can't point to what changed, exactly, but you feel it in how the air settles. In universities across the conclave, the debates ran for generations. In the war rooms of the Rail, quiet revisions were made to tactical doctrine, without anyone saying why. In Keth research labs, xenobiologists kept writing papers that circled the same unanswerable center, building bigger and more precise instruments for looking at something that had stopped agreeing to be found by instruments. And somewhere in all of it, in the debates and the revisions and the papers, in the late-night conversations between exhausted scientists and the long silences of politicians who had run out of confident things to say, the question kept arriving. What were we so afraid of? Nobody answered it directly. It sat in the middle of all the other questions the way the deepest questions always sit. Not demanding, not loud, just present, patient, waiting. But the answer was there. It had always been there. Not that humans had become dangerous, or uncontrollable, or too powerful to manage. That they had shown, simply by doing it, that the ceiling was not a ceiling. That the shape was not the self. That the limit was not a law. And that the only thing standing between any species and what it could truly become was the quiet daily decision to keep believing that what it was right now was all it was ever allowed to be. Tay went home in the dark, her notebook in her pocket. She fell asleep thinking about footprints,